So this is a couple of days after the Africa Climate Summit that was held in Nairobi from the 4th to the 6th of September. And it's been amazing. I mean, I'm sure there are mixed emotions. There are expectations from before the summit, and this is post the summit. And we get to do a postmortem of how did it go? You know, what do you feel? What do you think, or how do you think Africa performed? And how do you think Kenya performed when it comes to hosting? And what exactly was the outcome vis-a-vis the objectives that were there at the beginning? On this episode, I get to share my views and my reflections on the Africa Climate Summit that just concluded. My name is Stella Bogonko, co-founder and CEO Jacobs Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa. And so on this episode, we get to review what exactly was the outcome of the Africa Climate Summit, and I get to share my reflections on what I think and how I think Kenya performed and Africa performed, and what exactly was the output vis-a-vis the objectives that were set at the beginning. If you remember in a previous episode, we aired the 4 objectives. We spent time going into details on what exactly the 4 objectives were. And just to refresh our memory, the 4 objectives were: the first one was to make sure there is an Africa Leaders Nairobi Declaration, which would be the summary of the conversations, of the agreements, of the direction that the continent would take when it comes to climate conversations at a global stage. The second one was to converse and to have contributions made towards a global finance structure. And as we said, I'll be running you through what that meant and what the outcome was and what the conversations were at the summit and what I think in terms of the way forward. The third one was to make sure that there were tangible announcements, so that it's not just a conversation where people are coming to just have talks and have repetitions of things that have been said in other forums before, but that they would make sure that there are actual tangible outcomes that come from the summit. And then the last one was to make sure that there's a roadmap, because like we said, you can have great conversations, a great plan, but if you do not have an implementation plan, it will definitely not be executed and it would be a waste of time. So how did we fare as a continent? How did we fare in terms of achieving these 4 objectives? Let's start with the first one. As we all know, the African Leaders Nairobi Declaration was read out, it was shared, and there's been a lot of conversations about that. There's been both negative and positive feedback. As any other, kind of document that comes up, there's always those people that felt that they did not get to contribute or they do not feel represented by that document. And you have civil society organizations and other kinds of organizations that have aired their views, saying that they wanted a stronger African position when it comes to certain issues, especially around the loss and damage fund, and just making sure that the civil society's voice is heard. And as it was said in a different forum, it's great to have that kind of feedback, because it creates the checks and balances that we need to make sure that not just that the population or the citizens of the different African countries are represented, but to make sure that we are not leaving anything on the table, that everything that needs to be factored in is factored in. And so the declaration, which we'll be sharing in the next episode on what some of the highlights are, I think was a great representation of the conversations that were held. Could there have been a stronger position? I'll leave that to you to determine. We did say that one of the challenges that would have come up, which eventually ended up being highlighted in some of the conversations that were held, was the balance around especially the issue of energy transition. How do we make sure that countries that are heavily dependent and even discovering more oil are able to benefit from these discoveries while still adopting a renewable energy pathway? And how do we adopt a common position that represents the kind of countries like Kenya that are 93% renewable in their grid, and countries like South Africa and Nigeria that are heavily dependent on coal and oil? How do we make sure that one common African position represents these 2 kinds of scenarios? And that's where the just and equitable position comes in. And so there's a declaration. We will be breaking it down for you in the next episode, so stay tuned for that. The second objective was to make sure that there is contributions and views have an African position on what the global restructuring of the global financial infrastructure or financial system looks like. And for those who haven't caught that episode, I will give you a snapshot, but you can feel free to check the previous episode where we broke it down, articulating what the second objective is. And so in summary, as we said, the conversation around climate is largely a financial conversation, because many of the developed countries, or the global north as they are known, have industrialized and benefited and are have measures in place even to deal with some of the climatic shocks that happen in their own countries because they've invested heavily in their economies and have benefited from the benefits of coal and oil. But not so the African continent, where while we have large deposits of oil and minerals and renewable energy potential, most of it has not been exploited. And so in a way, we are still lagging behind in terms of development, but we are facing the effects, the adverse effects of climate. So how do we make sure that the kind of funding that flows into the various countries is representative and allows many of these global south countries to benefit from the what we call loss and damage fund, or just in innovative ways of making sure that these countries benefit from the funding that is available. And this is in the Bretton Woods institutions, which are your IMF, your World Banks, and the like. Currently, that structure is heavily skewed towards the global north, which means that they borrow at significantly less percentages compared to the global south. And so when it comes to development, many of the African countries are struggling when it comes to, balancing between development, just your normal development that is required, and climate resilient development, which means, can we develop as, for example, in the agriculture space, can we invest more in climate smart agriculture as opposed to just, normal agriculture, traditional methods of agriculture? So the climate conversation, or the climate finance in conversation, was a needful one. And that's why it was elevated to be a global conversation that would then be domesticated or localized at the summit. Was this achieved? Do you feel that this was achieved? Do we have a stronger position beyond the Paris summit that was already held in June earlier this year? Do we have a clear position as an African continent? We do have there were positions that were fronted, especially by the Kenyan president, around carbon tax. There was an issue around, can we have debt pardoning or halting the, some sort of a debt break that allows countries in the developing world to be able to benefit from their own revenues and the other sources of revenues that are currently there, to focus a lot more on climate resilient funding as opposed to balancing between the two, like I mentioned earlier. I still feel that there could be a stronger position, and I know that this is one of the things that is being championed at the global stage, and I do believe that we do need to solidify that position a bit further, because while we are raising the concern, the hope is that the conversations that were held in Paris, cemented in Nairobi, will take center stage, especially in Dubai later on this year when COP28 is held. The third objective of the summit was to make sure that there are tangibles and announceables out of the summit. I would say that there were quite a number of, announcements that were made, especially around the 26 billion that's being spoken about when it comes to various investments from governments, other governments and multilateral banks and agencies. And this is great. It's money that we didn't have a month ago, and these are investments that were not there necessarily there a month ago. So this is great that even the private sector came on board and are committing to all this financing to make sure that African countries are able to benefit, and these funds would go into areas like climate smart agriculture, renewable energy, e-mobility, and many others that would enable the continent to move closer to a greener continent and a greener future. So there were announceables, and that's an objective that I would say was met, and it's kudos to the organizers and especially to the leadership of the African Union and our own president for achieving that. Finally, the last objective was to make sure that we have a roadmap, because like we said, it's one thing to have a great plan, it's another thing to be able to implement it. And this, as we all know, was not necessarily achieved at the summit, but it was mandated and it's captured in the declaration that the African Union would then be tasked with the duty of breaking down the outcome of the Nairobi Declaration to be able to make sure that there's a proper roadmap that is then going to be used as the implementation plan for how to make sure that the commitments that were made, the agreements that were arrived at by the various countries and by African countries as well, because African countries also made their own commitments at the summit. Can we make sure that they actually honor them in the roadmap that is captured? And that's the role that the African Union was given. My take on the outcome of the summit, I would say that it was quite an amazing feat, especially for us as Kenya to be able to host such an amazing event. It was a couple of days, 5 days, including the Africa Climate Week, which was happening from the 4th to the 8th, concurrently to the Africa Climate Summit. I think it was a brilliant opportunity for the African nations and for Africa as a continent to showcase that we're not just asking for help, we're also bringing solutions to the table. Did we offer solutions? I believe we did, especially when it comes to the conversations around the carbon sinks, around the Congo Basin, and also the renewable energy potential that we have as a continent. We are finally coming to the place where we're saying we don't necessarily ask for aid for the sake of aid, but we're asking for partnerships. We're asking for investments. We're asking for opportunities to be able to tap into our potential as a continent. And I think that particular objective was achieved. So from my own perspective, I believe that it was a very successful first attempt at making sure that we're not just going to someone else's table, but we are creating our own table and inviting other people to sit at the table to hear what we have to offer. It was an amazing show of, global leaders. There were amazing and different representations from private sector to NGOs, to the civil society, to young, youth and donors and different players in the space who came together. And especially during the side events, you had to be there to experience not just the energy, but the ideas. My hope, and I know that this has been captured and will be captured in the report that will be coming out, is that there were those outcomes from those side events, especially, that would be captured in ways that could inform policy moving forward. So I think that we were successful, but like I said, in many forums during the summit and even now, that was a first step out of the cave. We definitely have a lot more work to do, and that means that we have to maintain the pressure. We have to maintain the insistence and clarity of exactly what we are asking for and what we are bringing to the table as a continent. Do you have views on your own experience for the many 20,000 plus people that participated in the summit? Close to 30,000 actually that participated in the summit. What is your experience like? Do you feel like it met your expectations? Did you learn anything? Did you meet exciting or interesting people? I believe that it was a great opportunity for Africa and for Kenya. We do have a lot to offer. We just need to be able to maintain that momentum. So those are my thoughts and my views as I reflect on the summit. It was great in many ways. I think that we just need to maintain the momentum, but we do need to also ask ourselves a question. And this is reflective based on many meetings and many global and even continental meetings that have been held. What will be different about this one? Well, many countries came, and even those that were not necessarily represented by the head of state, they did have representation. What's going to change in your country? What's going to change in our country, especially in Kenya? We do need to have some form of roadmap for ourselves, especially for those who participated at the summit. How will this be different? It's very easy to go for many of these forums and just have great conversations, make great contacts, but have no significant or commensurate impact on the ground. My prayer is that this one will be different, because we must show the world that these conversations have to translate to something. And that's what I hope that the African Union will come out with, a tangible, not just a list of things to do and how to do it or when to do it, but also a monitoring and evaluation framework that allows us to hold ourselves accountable and as citizens to hold our countries accountable, to check that we are complying to the commitments that we made and pushing the boundaries of those commitments, and also showcasing what can be done. Thank you very much for joining me today. I hope that you learned a thing or two, or also got to be updated, for those of you who are not there, to know exactly what happened at the summit. And if you do have comments, if you'd like to share your views, your own experience of the summit, I know that there's feedback, areas of improvement that we as a country could improve perhaps, you could please feel free to share that in the comment section below, and we'll get back to you if we can, or just continue and keep the conversation going. My name is Stella Bogonko, co-founder and CEO Jacob's Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa.